In the decade after World War I, the spread of new technologies increased American engagement with the world. American business also became more international than ever before. People around the globe bought American products and watched American-made movies. At the same time, many Americans tried to isolate the country from the rest of the world. Hostility to outsiders led to harsh restrictions on immigration. Parts of the American and the world economy thrived, but the widening gap between rich and poor and the unhealthy economic legacy of the war eventually led to a long depression. Modern advertising encouraged demand for newly available goods, and Americans borrowed billions of dollars to buy modern marvels such as cars, radios, and electrical appliances, all made available through mass production. Many Americans reveled in this new consumer culture and were proud that people around the globe sought to emulate it. Others, however, decried modern mass consumption as boorish, hollow, and vapid. Radio developed into one of the most popular modes of communications in the 1920s. By the end of World War I, the technology and corporate structure were in place for a revolution in communication that would allow listeners easy access to information and entertainment created halfway around the globe. Early radios were sold as kits, assembled at home and often modified and improved by builders. These radios quickly captured the imagination of inventive Americans eager to tinker with the shoebox-sized contraptions. Commercial radio broadcasting started on the night of November 2nd, 1920. A small audience of wireless enthusiasts in the Northeast tuned in to hear East Pittsburgh's news station, KDKA, broadcast the Warren Harding James Cox presidential election returns. 2 years later, there were 500 radio stations around the country, with radios in 3 million American homes and President Harding's office. The hobby of the few had become a national obsession and a $60 million a year business. Radio broadcasts quickly spread worldwide. Countries in the Western Hemisphere, heavily influenced by U.S. stations, established privately owned stations, while in Europe, governments set up broadcasting operations. American companies battled each other over patent rights and engaged in a heated rivalry with British allies over who would control the airwaves. Woodrow Wilson deemed American supremacy in radio technology important enough to help convince General Electric to reassign patent rights and establish the Radio Corporation of America. The rapidly evolving technology spawned a powerful communications industry, and RCA emerged as the dominant company. By 1922, the radio was the most sought-after consumer product in the nation, and radio broadcasts were the most significant form of mass culture. By the end of the decade, the radio had profoundly altered patterns of daily life as families reorganized their habits to catch favorite shows. Radio changed the way people thought and bought. As radios became increasingly elaborate and expensive, consumers often had to buy their sets on credit. And for rural Americans, the radio provided a vital link to the broader civic and cultural life of the nation writ large, which helped justify the purchase. Some traditionally minded critics disapproved of the open access of the airwaves, fearing that it fostered immorality. Like other popular media of the 1920s, radio openly expressed the sexual desires of the age. Songs like Burning Kisses, I Need Lovin', and Hot Lips floated on the air, easily accessible to young people who gravitated to the new technology with a fervor that frightened many religious and community leaders. For African Americans, radio perpetuated and nationalized old stereotypes through wildly popular shows like Amos and Andy, in which white actors portrayed black characters as good-natured, submissive fools. Radio also popularized jazz and other forms of regional music created in their culture. Along with the radio, the growth of the automobile industry had a profound effect on American society in the 1920s. Henry Ford adopted mass production techniques with the introduction of the moving assembly line in 1903. This method allowed Ford to manufacture his Model T quickly, efficiently, and cheaply in his Highland Park, Michigan plant. With the Model T, automobiles for the first time became affordable, versatile, and relatively reliable. Sales of Ford's Tin Lizzie soared. Car purchases from General Motors and the third of the big three, Chrysler, multiplied as well. Vehicle registration more than doubled from 3 million in the early 1920s to 8.25 million by 1927. By 1930, Los Angeles, with a population of under 2 million, contained more cars than did all of Asia with its more than 800 million population. Cars changed the way Americans viewed consumption in fundamental ways. In the mid-1920s, Alfred P. Sloan, chairman of GM, attacked Ford's dominant market position by introducing new GM models every year. Sloan's notion of planned obsolescence boosted sales, luring consumers into purchasing new cars before their old ones wore out. GM also increased sales by offering installment purchasing and promoting the idea of a product ladder with different grades of cars pegged to different incomes. And by 1927, 2/3 of car buyers used the installment plan, as they sometimes spent above their means to participate in the car craze. In late 1927, Ford responded to GM's innovations. Their rollout of the more comfortable Model A to replace the Model T resulted in a frenzy of interest from the media and the public. Cars revolutionized mobility. Farmers and their families could now easily travel to town to shop, eat, and enjoy other recreational opportunities. Urban families took leisurely Sunday drives through the countryside. Some grabbed food at the new drive-in restaurants. Closed cars served as mobile bedrooms for teens and young adults who wished to escape their parents' watchful eyes. Car owners embarked on long-distance vacations on which they could stay at an auto camp or one of the new motels popping up along the highways. Along the way, drivers could fill up at one of the new gas stations or stop at one of the tourist attractions that dotted the roads. Cars and better roads also facilitated the rapid growth of suburban communities on the outskirts of the nation's major cities. The population of Grosse Pointe, outside of Detroit, increased 724% throughout the 1920s. Shaker Heights, near Cleveland, grew 1,000%, and the Los Angeles suburb of Beverly Hills swelled by 2,485%. Open spaces and comfortable homes attracted middle-class families to the new residential communities. By the mid-1920s, automobile manufacturing was the country's fastest-growing industry and provided much of the decade's labor growth and prosperity. 1 out of every $5 spent by consumers went towards automobiles. By 1929, the industry employed almost 13% of all manufacturers. The financial health of other industries, such as petroleum, steel, glass, and rubber, also relied heavily on the auto industry. Industrialists such as Ford branched out globally. In an ultimately futile effort to find a cheap and stable source of natural rubber for tires, Ford carved out a vast plantation called Fordlandia in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. Tire manufacturer Harvey Firestone built more successful rubber plants in Liberia. Automakers also sold their products abroad, modifying their cars for foreign tastes, establishing subsidiaries, and building plants outside the U.S. By 1928, American multinational firms in France and Germany outpaced production of domestic auto industries in both countries. By the mid-1930s, Ford and GM had manufacturing operations in nearly every major market worldwide. U.S. production plants popped up in Australia, Japan, and even in the communist Soviet Union. In the 1920s, advertising took on new importance as mass consumption drove the American economy. American business, perfecting methods to make people believe that they needed new goods, created sophisticated campaigns in print and on radio airwaves. Ads aimed to show how a product could reshape a consumer's image and even enhance their social standing. They frequently employed movie stars and other popular personalities to endorse mundane products. By gargling the same brand of mouthwash as movie idol Rudolph Valentino, consumers were promised a new status and even happiness as the result of a simple purchase. Cigarette makers encouraged women to, quote, reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet. Ads also heightened demand for amazing new home appliances such as electric washers, stoves, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners. Ad men of the 1920s perfected new methods that drew on insights from psychology and anthropology to shift Americans away from traditional values of thrift toward borrowing and spending on non-essential personal items. Edward Bernays, a nephew of the newly popular psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, pushed for explicitly sexual appeals in ads. Ads in magazines and newspapers, on roadside billboards, and on the radio raised awareness of personal health, hygiene, and appearance. Dramatic ads, warning Americans of the shame of bad breath and the dangers of bad manners, generated remarkable sales for products as different as mouthwash and Elbert Hubbard's scrapbook, A Guide to Self-Improvement. By 1927, American corporations spent more than $1.5 billion per year on advertising. Racism merged with anti-immigrant sentiment and a revived Ku Klux Klan. The Klan of the Reconstruction era resurfaced in the 1920s with a new anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish message. The appearance in 1915 of a blockbuster film about Reconstruction called The Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith, helped spur the revival. The movie, a technical marvel of early cinema, depicted the Klan as a heroic organization saving civilization by rescuing white women from brutal, sex-crazed black men. The ranks of the Klan, restricted to native-born Protestants, swelled after 1920, more in the Midwest than in its original birthplace in the South. It even spawned imitators. In Cuba, for example, a Ku Klux Klan Cubano arose to enforce segregation and to, quote, protect white women. Dues and sales of robes, hoods, and whips generated an estimated $75 million in profits for Klan leaders. White women also joined and formed the Women of the KKK. Motivated by many of the same fears as the male members, Klan women advocated for the protection of, quote, pure womanhood and the sanctity of the American home, end quote. Klan membership peaked in 1925 at about 5 million members. That year, 40,000 robe members paraded down Washington's Pennsylvania Ave. To escape the Jim Crow South, African Americans continued their massive migration from the southern countryside to northern cities. Continuing the flow of the 500,000 who migrated during World War I, 1 million blacks left the rural South in the 1920s. At the end of the decade, 40% of black Americans lived in cities compared to 25% in 1910. Despite an atmosphere of repression, African Americans made some notable progress in the 1920s. Harlem, a largely black section of New York City, came to epitomize the vibrant black artistic and literary culture that flowered in the 1920s. A product of the ongoing migration of blacks, both from the South as well as from the West Indies, the Harlem Renaissance helped construct a new identity for black Americans. The new Negro, who exuded self-confidence, bowed to no one, and confronted racism head-on. Writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance disagreed about the nature of art. Should it be a weapon in the battle for civil rights, or should artists be free to create as they pleased? This creative tension helped to produce a wide range of artistic creations, some of which are considered masterpieces of art and literature, and moved the black experience to the mainstream of American culture. Thrill-seeking whites sought out Harlem, especially its nightclubs, which featured jazz. The product of black migration and the cross-fertilization of musical styles carried to the nation's cities, jazz captured the mood of the 1920s. The Cotton Club, Harlem's most famous nightclub, catered to the fascination with the, quote, exotic and authentic black culture as it was packaged by white club owners. But these clubs were segregated for white customers only. Blacks in Harlem, as in nearly every American city, patronized their own jazz clubs, often small speakeasies and chicken shacks. Jazz clubs also flourished in European cities such as Paris and Berlin. African-American soldiers first introduced jazz to France during World War I, and, quote, musical missionaries, returning in the 1920s, recreated America's jazz culture in Paris. Technological advances such as the phonograph and radio also broadened jazz's appeal both nationally and internationally. Conservative white and black leaders, however, criticized jazz as decadent and an immoral music performed in sinful settings. Even as black culture flowered in the US and around the world in the 1920s, African Americans enjoyed a smaller share of the decade's prosperity. Fluctuations in wage work created depression conditions for many blacks before the Great Depression of the 1930s. Competing against white workers for industrial jobs, blacks usually found themselves relegated to the meanest, dirtiest, most dangerous, lowest paid, unskilled positions. But African Americans did find some new opportunities, most notably at the Ford Motor Company, which employed 5,000 black workers by 1923, compared to just 50 in 1916, although they were forced to live in a segregated town called Inkster. Although most black women remained mired in domestic jobs, they also made some inroads into better paying jobs in food industries, commercial laundries, and the needle trades. In 1925, angered at exclusion from white unions, Pullman railway porters, organized by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which, headed by leader A. Philip Randolph, played an active role in asserting black civil rights. But large-scale racial violence often overshadowed advances. In 1923, white mobs from rural counties in Indiana and North Carolina drove hundreds of black families out of their homes. Two of the most brutal assaults of the era occurred in Florida and Oklahoma. In May 1921, a white mob of around 5,000 men attacked a prosperous African-American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The mob gathered to lynch a black teenager accused of assaulting a white woman. The mob soon torched homes and businesses, burning alive some residents and shooting others. And by the time the National Guard restored order, above 300 blacks were killed. The thriving, mostly black mill town of Rosewood, Florida, suffered a similar fate in 1923. Hundreds of white men from nearby towns descended on Rosewood's 700 residents and, setting fire to homes and businesses, forced them to flee. Officially, 6 blacks died, although the actual tally was probably much higher. Faced with ongoing oppression at home, some black Americans began to reach out internationally. Pan-Africanism aimed to unite peoples of African descent around the world to seek equal rights and cast off white supremacy and colonialism. Harlem, which was home not only to American-born blacks, but also to many West Indians and Africans, provided fertile ground for Pan-Africanism. The movement received a major boost with the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference and plans for decolonization. Political activist and author W.E.B. Du Bois organized the Second Pan-African Congress, held in Paris in 1921, which attracted delegates from 15 countries and demanded, quote, "the development of Africa for the Africans and not merely the profit of Europeans," end quote. An alternative and controversial Pan-Africanism emerged under the leadership of Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant to New York. His Universal Negro Improvement Association became the largest black nationalist movement in history. The charismatic Garvey captured the imagination of the masses in the U.S. and abroad. The UNIA, insisting on black separatism and calling for Africa for Africans, claimed that 400 million people of African descent could free Africa from white imperialists and create their own nation. The UNIA also established black-owned and operated businesses, most notably the short-lived and ultimately bankrupt Black Star Shipping Line. Garvey inspired his followers around the world to think of themselves as a nation with a proud past and a sparkling future. He even created a national anthem, a flag, and a diplomatic corps, claiming for himself the title of Provisional President of Africa. The UNIA drew members from all over the world, including Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, as well as the U.S. UNIA membership far outstripped other black organizations, such as the NAACP. The Harlem Renaissance and Pan-Africanism reflected just one aspect of a broader cultural awakening. News traveled fast in the 1920s, and new means of communications hastened the spread of national culture. Across the country, people attended the same movies, read the same books, followed the same sports teams, and shared the same instant heroes. The new technologies of radio and the movies helped spread American culture around the globe. Especially in Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere, new media fortified people's ideas of the U.S. as a huge, rich land. The new culture may have been highly popular, but many Americans were dismayed by the new trends. Some religious people expressed disappointment and outrage at what they considered to be the immorality of the new consumerist age.
Mammy, I'm coming. I hope I didn't make you wait. Mammy, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late. Mammy, don't you know me? It's a little baby. I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. For my me.
The 1927 film The Jazz Singer marked the greatest technological breakthrough of the decade as the first talkie with extended dialogue. Many movies of the 1920s reflected the tensions of this, quote, new era. As films provided a glimpse into the lives of the rich and famous, Hollywood soon began to shape national and international perceptions about fashion, etiquette, morals, and success. The movie's portrayal of unheard of wealth and high fashion may have had an even greater impact on people's ideas of American life around the globe than it did in the US. At home, at least, people could compare their own rather ordinary lives to the images on the screen. They enjoyed the fantasy, but they knew it was just that, an unrealistic depiction of life. Internationally, American movies offered a tantalizing glimpse of a rich land populated with beautiful people wrapped in finery. Westerns and romances featuring beautiful young city dwellers proved especially popular abroad. But not everyone appreciated the effect cinema's popularity had on traditional values. Facing pressure from conservative groups, in 1921, the movie studios appointed Postmaster General Will Hayes to censor their films. Hayes prohibited risque content on the screen and monitored appropriate behavior for actors and actresses off the screen. An unparalleled interest in sports also skyrocketed several athletes into superstardom during the 1920s. Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees established himself as a larger-than-life figure, and fans flocked to professional baseball games. Hitting 60 home runs during the Yankees' dominant 1927 season, the Sultan of Swat set a record that would stand for more than 30 years. Ruth's gregarious, infectious personality off the field likewise endeared him to fans. Professional football player Harold Redgrange, boxer Jack Dempsey, tennis player Will Tilden, and golfer Bobby Jones likewise drew millions of fans during the decade. Huge crowds turned out for college football games. To the dismay of those who worried that too much attention to athletes would sidetrack the academic mission of higher education, several universities, including Yale, Ohio State, and Stanford, began building stadiums that held more than 60,000 people. And by the end of the decade, more fans attended college football games than professional baseball games. With more leisure time on their hands and money in their pockets, many sought to emulate their favorite athletes by participating in sports as well as by watching them. For example, by 1927, the U.S. had approximately 5,000 golf courses and 2 million players. The 1920s was also a decade of instant celebrity. No one symbolized the spirit of the new era better than the boyishly handsome 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh, who collected a $25,000 cash prize for being the first aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. Radio reporters breathlessly announced every minute of his 33-hour flight from Long Island to Paris in May of that year. As a goodwill ambassador, Lindbergh, or Lucky Lindy as he was called, promoted American aviation around the world. Tragedy engulfed his family in 1932 when his 2-year-old son was kidnapped and murdered. Lindbergh's reputation also suffered a severe blow in the late 1930s when he sympathized with Nazi Germany and opposed American entry into World War II. Despite the general prosperity of the 1920s, not all Americans considered the U.S. a happy home. Some lost faith in traditional American values and grew alienated after the experience of World War I. Many writers and artists fled to Europe, especially France, where they hoped to live a more authentic existence. Other intellectuals remained in the US but wrote scathing critiques of what they saw as the emptiness of mainstream middle-class American culture. Many of the intellectuals who left the US for Europe in the 1920s, the so-called lost generation, had become disillusioned with the present-day society and its ideas of progress. In his 1929 book, A Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway wrote, quote, "The war annihilated all reason, virtue, and human compassion," end quote. Additionally, Hemingway and those who joined him in Paris, most notably F. Scott Fitzgerald, found life in the U.S. stifling, puritanical, driven by big business, and full of hypocrisy. In Paris, they directly challenged those values, enjoyed a less inhibited lifestyle, and began writing some of the decade's most influential works. Regardless of the critique of literary expatriates, the 1920s was also a time of great artistic creativity in the U.S. In 1920, Sinclair Lewis began the charge by attacking small-town life in Main Street. His incisive criticism of the bigotry and shallowness of middle-class America struck a chord, and the novel became a national bestseller. In 1922, Lewis followed with Babbitt, an even greater success that satirized business culture. F. Scott Fitzgerald also addressed the hollow, unfulfilling lifestyle of the rich in The Great Gatsby. The loudest voice of social criticism during the 1920s came from Baltimore-based journalist H.L. Mencken. In 1924, he launched the American Mercury, a magazine that served as the vehicle for Mencken's piercing attacks on rural life, popular culture, religion, democracy, politicians, and what he called the bourgeoisie. Mencken coined the derogatory moniker Monkey Trial for the Scopes Evolution trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, and led the charge of journalists there to create a circus-like atmosphere. He was especially popular among college students who imitated his irreverence. One Harvard student remarked, quote, "The American Mercury was our Bible, and Mencken our God," end quote. Just as jazz signified the 1920s, the flapper symbolized the new woman of that decade. She wore short skirts, cultivated a boyish figure, rouged her cheeks, bobbed her hair, and turned down her flesh-colored stockings. She smoked cigarettes in public, drank alcohol, danced the shimmy in jazz clubs, and flirted openly with her male playmates. Her behavior, scandalous by her mother's standards, represented, quote, "feminism, new style," end quote, according to an observer. Often indifferent to women's organizations and causes such as suffrage and equal rights that had helped bond her mother's generation, the flapper stressed her individuality and freedom. Clara Bow, who was known as the It Girl, epitomized the flapper new woman of the 1920s. It was a quality of magnetic personality and physical attraction, as well as self-confidence. With boyishly tousled bobbed hair, big brown eyes, and heart-shaped mouth, she was the biggest Hollywood star of the era, and women in the U.S. and abroad copied her, quote, "jazz baby style." The flapper became a jazz-age female ideal replicated around the world, especially through movies and broadly circulated American magazines such as Judge, Puck, Vanity Fair, Life, and McClure's. The flapper featured prominently in movies such as A Social Celebrity and Rolled Stockings. The pleasure-seeking flapper embodied a new understanding of female sexuality in the 1920s. As youth culture expanded, with more young men and women attending high schools and co-ed colleges and universities, young Americans developed new ways of dating and interacting. New theories of sexuality, such as those posited by Sigmund Freud, stressed female pleasure and condemned, quote, "inhibitions" as unhealthy. Birth control also became more accessible. Liberated from the supervision of parents and chaperones, young men and women exercised their sexual freedom, engaged in petting parties, and enjoyed the privacy of automobile back seats. Despite a rebellious image, the new woman of the 1920s continued to embrace many traditional values. Marriage generally remained her end goal, the means to personal fulfillment. Almost all Americans considered, quote, normal sex to be heterosexual and occurring within marriage. As women contended to land a husband, female relationships often became rivalries. Advertisements, which used female sexuality to market all kinds of items, accentuated female competition. Ads, for example, tried to convince women that they needed to purchase beauty products to vie successfully for a husband and to keep him. Sales of cosmetics exploded in the 1920s, and the Miss America Beauty Contest, first held in 1921, embodied the competitive dimension of the new womanhood as young women contended to represent the American ideal of beauty. Despite her pervasive image, the flapper was not the only, quote, new woman in the 1920s. Movies and magazines also glamorized the modern working girl. Secretarial work, once the province of young businessmen on their way up the corporate ladder, became a respectable job for young, middle-class white women in the 1920s. But this kind of work was viewed not as a career, but only as a temporary phase before marriage and a return to the home. For working-class women, the carefree flapper, the college co-ed, the glamorous working girl, or even the contented housewife rarely reflected their lives. Most working women in the 1920s remained in the occupations they had held previously, such as domestic service, agricultural labor, and certain kinds of manufacturing jobs. White women from the southern countryside labored in increasingly harsh conditions in textile mills. Most black women toiled in domestic service jobs. Puerto Rican and Cuban women produced clothing and cigars in urban sweatshops, while the majority of Mexican immigrant women worked as domestics or agricultural workers. Yet even among women in remote parts of the country, the flapper made an impact. Southern mill girls, for example, bobbed their hair, listened to jazz on the radio, danced the shimmy, and saved their money for cosmetics and stylish dresses. Conflicts over the prohibition of alcohol became another flashpoint of the cultural divisions of the 1920s. The 18th Amendment, passed in 1919, forbade the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. Although Prohibition put neighborhood saloons out of business, illegal speakeasies flourished. Nevertheless, Dries defended Prohibition for driving down the rate of alcohol consumption. Wetz countered that Prohibition simply drove drinking underground and penalized workers unable to afford the high prices charged by speakeasies. Prohibition also, they argued, encouraged the consumption of hard liquor over beer and wine and promoted the rise of organized crime and violent criminals such as Al Capone, who supplied booze to a thirsty public. Despite the controversy, Prohibition grew into an international movement. Several Canadian provinces restricted the consumption of alcohol at roughly the same time as the U.S., but cries for repeal arose more quickly there. The provinces of Ontario and Alberta, however, repealed their anti-liquor laws in 1927. Prohibition also changed U.S. relations with its neighbors. Tourists flocked to Cuba to patronize casinos and brothels owned by American gangsters and well-stocked with liquor. Mexico and Canada became sources for smuggled whiskey. The province of Ontario, as well as Quebec, which did not ban alcohol, became major sources of Canadian whiskey. Distilleries north of the border produced liquor that was smoother tasting and not as physically harming as some of the deadly concoctions made by American bootleggers, sometimes in bathtubs. Americans remained sharply divided over Prohibition throughout the 1920s. Many Protestants supported what they called the, quote, noble or great social experiment, while most Catholics and Jews condemned it as an assault on their culture and personal liberty. Republicans, along with many Southern and Western Democrats, generally supported Prohibition. Dries often identified with the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-Hollywood views of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Northern Democrats, exemplified by New York Governor Al Smith, bitterly opposed both Prohibition and nativism. By 1928, Prohibition had become an intensely partisan issue. The northern, urban wing of the Democratic Party, led by its presidential nominee Al Smith, supported repeal of the 18th Amendment. Republican Herbert Hoover defended Prohibition as a noble experiment and won the presidential election.
You want your sweet, innocent girls to take to booze so they can be enticed into honky-tonks by slick-haired vultures who prey on the flower of American womanhood. I say alcohol must go.
Prices soared in 1928. General Motors, for instance, rose 75 points on the stock exchange in 2 months. RCA stock was 85 at the beginning of 1928. At the end of the year, it reached 420 and sold for $505 a share. Many people bought stock on margin, putting down 10% of the purchase price and borrowing the rest from brokerage houses. Banks bought stock and companies loaned banks money to buy more. When prices rose, people thought they were making money. However, if stock prices fell, borrowers could not pay off their loans with their stock. But few foresaw a stock market crash, and companies issued more and more shares to take advantage of ever-rising stock prices. Minimal government regulation allowed companies to issue shares with no underlying value. They were not required to certify the financial worthiness of investment holding companies or of banks that owned stock in major companies. The Florida land boom and bust provided a foretaste of the catastrophe awaiting Wall Street in 1929. Cheap land, warm weather, and zealous promoters encouraged real estate developers to invest heavily in Florida in the early 1920s. Entrepreneurs promoted it as a vacation destination and to investors looking to get rich off its new popularity. Humorist Will Rogers once said of Carl Fisher that he, quote, rehearsed the mosquitoes till they would not bite you until after you bought. Most investors simply intended to resell their property for a profit. Thousands of people paid increasingly outlandish sums for, quote, 50 feet in paradise. But speculation caught up with Florida by 1926. Investors discovered to their chagrin that much of the land they bought was unusable swampland or was permanently underwater. Many began pulling their money out of the state. In addition to irresponsible speculation, income disparities and rampant use of credit also destabilized the economy. The income of the wealthiest 1% of Americans doubled, while the income of the bottom third rose only 6% in the decade. Income tax cuts returned money to the wealthy but did little for the middle class or the poor. While rich Americans could keep on buying washing machines, refrigerators, radios, and cars, the bottom two-thirds found themselves stretched to the limit. By 1929, American factories, like farms, were guilty of overproduction. Manufacturers cut prices and then reduced their output. They laid off workers who in turn cut back on their purchases. Borrowers stopped paying their consumer loans, leaving banks and stores with millions in bad debt. Wild speculation, inequities of wealth, massive consumer borrowing, lax government regulation, international trade barriers, and excessive international lending culminated in a perfect storm on Wall Street. Stock prices peaked in September 1929 and then drifted lower. On Thursday, October 24th, prices fell sharply in the morning. At noon, bankers met at the offices of J.P. Morgan and announced they would step in to buy shares that afternoon, and prices stabilized. But on Monday, October 28th, prices fell again, and then on Black Tuesday, October 29th, the bottom dropped out of the market. Everyone wanted out, as banks and brokerage houses demanded the sale of stock to pay off margin debt. By the end of the day, 16 million shares, 3 times the normal number, traded hands. The stock market ticker, the record of trades, fell hours behind. All the gains of 1929 had been wiped out. By the end of November, stock prices fell to half of what they had been worth at their height. By 1930, people began to talk of major economic depression. In 1929, the unemployment rate was as low as 3.2%, but it shot up to 8.7% in 1930. Government policies made the depression worse. Secretary of the Treasury Mellon thought the downward spiral would correct itself. He said, quote, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 made it even harder for international manufacturers to sell products in the U.S. When other countries raised their tariffs in retaliation, the volume of international trade dropped from 2.9 billion in 1929 to 2.1 billion in 1930 to 1.6 billion in 1931. The Federal Reserve made matters worse by raising interest rates and shrinking the money supply. This mistake devastated the nation's banks. More than 1,600 banks failed during the 1930s alone, and millions of homeowners lost their homes to foreclosure. President Hoover tried to arrest the slide by encouraging voluntary actions to relieve the suffering of those out of work and out of their houses. He insisted that, quote, "the fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis," end quote. But by 1931, few Americans believed him, and there was a widespread fear that this economic downturn was worse than any previous one.
Miami, I'm sweeping southward to Miami. Some little southward who waits beneath those Florida palms will soon be nesting right in my arms. I'll tell her how I've been scheming a love shelter for two to dreaming down by that shore